One of the biggest features missing from the original Breath of the Wild was classic Zelda Dungeons. We did have divine beasts and shrines dotted all over Hyrule, but the bigger dungeons with unique bosses and memorable weapons were missing from the overall package. Well, today I'm going to try and answer the question, will dungeons come back in Breath of the Wild 2? I'm going to check out the clues from trailers, IRL clues from job listings from Nintendo, plus also look at the benefits of dungeons coming to the sequel to Breath of the Wild. Well, if you're new around here or find this useful, don't forget to hit the subscribe button down below for all the latest Zelda content and turn on notifications by hitting that bell. Well, before I get into today's topic, let me know in the comments if you want to see dungeons make a return in Breath of the Wild 2. Also, I'd love to hear about your favourite dungeons from the Legend of Zelda series, which Zelda game did it come from and why is it your favourite? Well, Breath of the Wild doesn't have too many cons to it, it's mostly pros, with its vast open world, a sense of discovery and adventure around every corner. If you had to make a list of cons, then not having proper Zelda dungeons in the game would most likely be near the top of the list. I feel like I have to add a caveat here and define proper Zelda dungeons, given you could argue the Divine Beasts were kind of dungeons in Breath of the Wild. The additions of shrines and the Divine Beasts in Breath of the Wild was a great experiment. I talked about the sense of discovery and adventure before, and the shrines definitely helped with that. It was always exciting turning a corner and finding a new shrine, whether they be hidden behind a wall you had to blast through, or climbing to the highest peak to find. While I enjoyed the Divine Beasts, I wouldn't really class them as proper Zelda dungeons. So I felt the Divine Beasts had a design formula to them, they felt very samey, and the boss fights at the end were quite underwhelming. So I'd love to see classic dungeons make a return, where you have to find the map, the compass, a unique item associated to that dungeon, plus also have a unique boss battle at the end. We did get a very small teaser in the first Breath of the Wild trailer, back at E3 2019, where we see a shot of a big dark doorway. Since then, fans have speculated that dungeons may be making a return. However, it was only a very brief glimpse, but it was enough to set the Zelda fanbase onto months and years of speculation related to dungeons. There have also been some clues out there in real life related to dungeons coming to Breath of the Wild 2. Well, Nintendo posted some job listings for a terrain and level designer contract position, both which mention dungeons. The listings are mostly composed of standard information, such as preferred experience and potential compensation. However, the descriptions of the jobs themselves gives us a little bit more insight into the Breath of the Wild sequel. The terrain designer position will work on parts of the game, quote-unquote, such as field dungeons, and the level designer is going to work on, quote-unquote, game event, dungeon and field planning. And the latter position will also help work on creating and tweaking enemies, in case you're worried that the sequel wouldn't expand on the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and the relatively limited cast of enemies. So I do like the fact the job listings pointed out field dungeons and game event dungeon field planning. It sounds really promising when it comes to the addition of old school Zelda dungeons being in the sequel to Breath of the Wild. Hopefully we're going to get more information when Nintendo shows us their next Breath of the Wild 2 trailer. So I think there's a couple of benefits to dungeons coming to Breath of the Wild 2. Return of unique weapons and also the return of unique bosses. So when I talk about unique weapons, I would love to see more unbreakable weapons that play a key part in the adventure. So it definitely was a deliberate design decision to have breakable weapons in the original Breath of the Wild, and while I think this was a great experiment, I'd like to see the return of more non-breakable weapons, just like the Master Sword that we got near the end of our adventure. I do think these non-breakable weapons could live alongside breakable weapons. I wouldn't want to see them replace the breakable weapons completely. One of the tricky things to balance with the weapons and items is the freedom that Breath of the Wild offered you. So at the start of the game, you got the 4 Sheikah Slate runes, the Stasis, Bombs, Magnetism, and Cryonis, and from there you could go anywhere and complete any puzzle in Hyrule. You could rush to Hyrule Castle and take on Calamity Ganon if you wanted to, although staying alive would have been tough. I'm not a game designer, but I would love to see the Zelda team balance the addition of non-breakable weapons with the freedom of the open world that we had in Breath of the Wild. So another benefit of more traditional Zelda dungeons in Breath of the Wild 2 is that it could mean the return of unique boss battles. So the various blights in Breath of the Wild were good, but they all felt quite similar. Lionels also were good roaming bosses out there in the wild, but again, they did feel a little bit samey after a while. I'd love to see the return of unique bosses, epic boss fights, with bosses that are tailor-made to that dungeon. For example, if I'm in a forest temple, I want to be fighting a massive tree. If I'm underwater, I want to be fighting an octopus or a giant squid. You know, related to the previous topic of unique weapons, I do miss using that dungeon weapon against the bosses. So closest thing we have in Breath of the Wild to a traditional Legend of Zelda dungeon is Hyrule Castle itself. It's always looming in the background and feels impenetrable and almost impossible to conquer. There's so much build up to it, from travelling around Hyrule, getting all the divine beasts on your side, and finally taking on Calamity Ganon. Just getting to Hyrule Castle is an achievement in itself, given the amount of guardians that are protecting it from the outside, and also on the inner walls too. You know, Hyrule Castle embodies what is great about Breath of the Wild, given there's no one right way to get in. All entry points are dangerous, mind you, so there's no easy ride whether you find yourself going through the front door or through the secret passage. So here's some examples of great Zelda dungeons from the series. You know, I'd love to see something like this come to Breath of the Wild 2, but don't just let me suggest things to you. I'd love to hear your examples of great Zelda dungeons. Well, first up, we got the Forest Temple from the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. So this was the first temple in Ocarina of Time, and I know the game is full of great temples, so the Forest Temple is up there with my favourites. So visually, it's very recognisable with the lush green environment and the plant-like enemies. The design of the dungeon is great as the vines and the branches twist around each other, really reinforcing the nature theme. So we've got to hunt down the 4 Poe sisters in the paintings, plus you got the boss battle, which is just absolutely genius. Well, next up I've chosen Snow Peak Ruins. That's from the Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. So Snow Peak Ruins was one of the first to change up the Legend of Zelda dungeon formula from the traditional underground Zelda dungeons. You got Yito, and Yita made this dungeon their home and helped Link navigate the mansion in return for helping them to make soup. You've got the monsters and the locked rooms everywhere, but the overall calming nature of the location isn't what you'd expect from a traditional Zelda dungeon. You know, at the end, the Twilight Mirror manages to transform Yita in the dungeon, flipping the mood instantly, and that is one of the genius points of that dungeon. Really enjoy Snow Peak Ruins. And finally, one of my absolute favourites in the series, Earth Temple from the Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker. So this is a really great example of Zelda dungeon design. So the main gimmick here is light, and Link's ability to control it by bouncing beams off mirrors and activating switches. It's filled with undead zombie-like creatures, it's creepy, plus you got the chance to tackle it with Medley. She can fly and also help bounce light where it needs to go with her harp. This temple oozes atmosphere, plus the mechanics in the environment is absolutely fantastic. Well, let me know what you think about the potential of dungeons returning to Breath of the Wild 2. And that is it for this look at dungeons returning in Breath of the Wild 2. And as always, thank you so much for watching or listening. For more Legend of Zelda content like this, hit that subscribe button down below and subscribe to Triforce Times. Or you can catch me on Twitter at Triforce Times. Or if you enjoyed this video and found it useful, liking and sharing the video would really help me out. Otherwise, check out the other videos on the channel. Thanks again. I'll see you soon.